Um, Hi, sir. Good afternoon. So today, Elsmary and I will briefly introduce and reflect the article that you wanted us to reflect on. But before that, it might be good to introduce yourself a bit as to provide a background on how we came to our conclusions or our thoughts. So, as an introduction, my name is Priscilla Wang. I grew up here in the Netherlands, born and raised here, and I did a bachelor in economics and also a bachelor in law, also known as the Meester Doctorandus programma, just as Elsmarie. And I'm currently working on my thesis for International Management SEMS, which is a master's program of RSM. So I did management before. And now I'm actually started with commercial company law, which we really enjoy at the moment. So I'm looking forward to this discussion as it really matched my interest in management and law. Elsmarie, you go.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Elsmarie van den Herik, and as Priscilla already told, I also did a double bachelor's in law and economics. So last year I did my master's in international economics, and at the moment I'm also finalizing my thesis. So we are in very similar stages of our student life, and I'm also doing the master's commercial and company law. And it's been very fun until now. In the Masters in International Economics, we'll of course also discuss the role of firms in the international environment. So this should be an interesting discussion. So we should start off with the first question, I think, which is whether we agree or not with the article which we had to read. So, Priscilla, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can definitely start off. I just made some notes throughout this article that I read. So I would say, as a summary, that I do not fully agree with Professor Winter. Like, in the end, like where we have to go to, the big strategy that we have to set. I think that's something I do agree with Professor Winter. But if we start off with the introduction, the tone of the article, Professor Winter has a portrayal of the companies that do not care about other things than the prospect of financial outcomes for shareholders. But I do not really agree with this, as I did a management degree, and I do know that, for example, Unilever, they're really focusing on sustainability and trying to be a corporate social citizen in that sense. But also CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, he just announced that green investment will be their new standard in the world of asset management. And then if we look at CBRE, the biggest, the real estate firms, they also take into account the ESG factors, so the environmental, social, and government factors when doing their financial analysis. So the whole tone of Professor Winter stating that what matters in corporate decision making is the prospect of financial outcome for shareholders and not much else is something I definitely do not agree with. Then secondly, when we move on in the article, Professor Winter also states that companies have become amoral, but as I just said, I do not think that all companies are like that. Like Professor Winter said, that in today's dominant corporate context, only financial capital is rewarded at the expense of human capital, social capital, and natural capital. And that institutional investors, they only invest in companies which they search for with mathematical calculated absolute and relative returns. I definitely do not agree with that, because I think that Professor Winter forgot that when we invest, we do not only look at the financial factors and the financial analysis, but we also look at the qualitative part of it, which we definitely take into account the strategy of a firm, whether it is sustainable or not, how it is perceived by consumers, how it's perceived by government. So I definitely do not agree that when we invest, we only look at corporate individuals as, this machine that only looks at financial returns. So the whole tone of this article is definitely something I disagree with. But then when we look forward, when we look at what Professor Winter said, that what duty a financial, what a corporation has in terms of financial responsibility, societal responsibility, and how we should come there, that is something I do agree. I think I'm elaborating a lot, so maybe I should give the floor to Elsmarie.
No worries. Yes, so I think that those were very interesting comments. Yeah, I agree with your point that the tone of the article is a little bit negative in the sense that Mr. De Winter does seem to apply that a lot of the companies are the bad guys, and they need like restrictions in order to be viable in today's society or accepted in today's society. However, I do think that he has some points there. You mentioned a lot of interesting examples about companies who are really trying to promote sustainability into their into their operations. However, I do believe that in a lot of the cases, the main deciding factor will still be the financial returns. For example, in my master's, I worked on a project surrounding farmers in South America and the role of Nestle and Nespresso in financially compensating these farmers. And of course, they were very willing to incorporate sustainability and higher returns for these workers. But as soon as it costs a little bit more money, I think the price of coffee has to go up 1 cent in order to have these people have a sustainable lifestyle or a viable lifestyle, and then in the end, financial considerations always took priority. So I do believe that it may be necessary to impose stricter restrictions or stricter obligations on these companies and not trust too much on their own commitment towards sustainability or ESG, because they have very clear limits as it is shown in practice. And then for your second point about the fact that investors also often look at other factors than just financial returns. I'm not sure to what extent that is the case. I think it would be very interesting to have empirical data showing about whether that is the case. I have not seen much evidence of this in my experience with on the stock market, which I have to admit is not that extensive. But still, I'm rather doubtful whether there are indeed a lot of investors who look at these factors. But they are very interesting points. I think one very important point I do agree with in the article is about the remuneration of executives. That that by setting very short-term goals, there is a crowding out effect, and there is no intrinsic motivation or less intrinsic motivations for directors to do well and what does it say here, act pro-socially. So I think that the role of financial remuneration is maybe a little bit overstated, and I think that's also reflected in the public debate, which is often held when another bonus is announced for certain directors. So that's about the background. But I'm also talking a long time now, I realize. So I do think there is value in the proposal by Mr. Winter by addressing these issues, by including a duty of societal responsibility. So I think in the end, although we have a little different views on how to get there, I think we both agree that the duty of societal responsibility is an interesting proposal and that it really deserves attention. Maybe can we talk a little bit more about what this duty of societal responsibility, what we think about that exactly?
Definitely. Actually, I think there were 3 proposals, right, that he discussed, and also looking toward what you just said about the companies, about actually their purpose. In the end, that's about the purpose of certain companies, whether they take into account sustainability or not. I think that's a very interesting point. So I would say that for a proposal-wise change, I would agree with that, a purpose orientation that companies need to take into account, need to address. I think that's something very valuable, like the French Law Pact also did. So the purpose orientation, that's something I do agree with. Also, when we look at examples, I think in the news, it was just 2 days ago in the FD, I'm not sure, that there was about the biggest gloves company in Malaysia, that they actually violated the safety rules, and that like the 5,000 extra employees that they got into the company because of the extra demand for gloves, that they didn't really take care of them, and that in the end they got corona and people died of it. And then afterwards, because BlackRock is one of the biggest, like they have 1% of share or something in that company, that they actually voted against the reappointment of the directors of that company. So in that sense, we can see that BlackRock is really taking a stance in this corporate social citizen, or the duty of social responsibility of a company. And that is also that they've taken into account in their purpose orientation. That is why Larry Fink have had this that they send out this letter to their shareholders about their green investment purpose. So I definitely think that if a company can address their own purpose for itself, as to address the needs of society, that can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I think that actually ties into a very important condition for this kind of activism to work, which is either media attention or at least transparency that these things happen. Because, well, in this instance, I think this is a very good example then indeed of an investor taking a stance and making a change for the better in a certain company. But of course, this was preceded by media attention, or I assume, or at least they found out somehow. And I think that's a very key point to stress, that these things and these changes can only happen when we know about them. And this is also, of course, a condition which De Winter emphasizes in his article, which is that corporate decision maker needs to be based on transparency and getting out the right information, so that people can also actually be judged according to certain benchmarks about how they are doing, and based on that, actions or consequences can follow. So I think actually, yeah, that's a very interesting point, and I think that yeah, even disregarding the role of institutional investors, if this transparency was really increased, it could also have an important benefit in corporate decision making itself.
Definitely, definitely. Maybe tying in into this common, maybe I'm already passing this question and jumping to the question whether this should be regulated on EU level or Dutch level. But I do think, for example, why BlackRock had such a stance is also because of the ESG factors that they're taking into account. And that ties into the discussion that we had about transparency of a board regarding corporate governance. I think in the asset management world, there is this non-financial reporting directive on EU level, at least they're working on it. And BlackRock is actually helping the EU on setting the standard of ESG factors. And one of the things that was set in this directive is that companies should assess ESG and actually report how every decision that they made in that year is reflected into these ESG factors. So I definitely think that this is something we should think about, and this also ties into the stance of Professor Winter. I think one of his Dutch proposals, I think the third one, he actually proposed that we should report how every corporation has ensured that they're a responsible corporate citizen. So I definitely agree with that. And also the second point about a provision specifying its purpose, I also agree with that. But the only thing that stays vague to me, maybe you also have an opinion on that, is that there should be a proposal that extend the duty of executive and non-executive directors to ensure and monitor that the corporation acts as a responsible corporate citizen. I would say that after the discussion, we both agree on this, but it remains very vague on how he wants to ensure that and how he wants to regulate this on either an EU level or a national level. But if it were me like saying how you can regulate this, I do not think that we should interfere too much with the management and with the internal matters of a company, but we should rather say that there is a duty of care. I think that is enough for me to ensure that a company is a corporate socially responsible citizen. But it would be very vague to me if we'd have a regulation that's really sets at every point on what a company should do to become such a socially responsible citizen, because then you would give grounds for third parties to start a rechtszaak
Of course.
a legal dispute with with such a company. And I think that's something we want to avoid, because I do think, in my opinion, that the taxes are really high in the Netherlands, especially for smaller BVs, and we make it ourselves really, really difficult. Like, we make it for entrepreneurs very difficult if we even set more rules and regulations next to
Yeah.
the high taxes that we already have.
And also, I think the problem with having too much or too detailed regulation about this would be that it's simply not a one size fits all approach, right? Like restaurants and financial companies have totally different business plans and impact the environment and people in a very different way. So I think a general duty of care, which also Winter proposes, would be much more suitable to achieve. More moral, as he says it, companies. So I totally agree with you there. I think, however, it is, and that is of course always the problem with these things, is that it is difficult to imagine how exactly in practice this would work. So the reporting, of course, is already a very good step into the right direction. But sometimes a company, of course, has to make decisions in which he has to balance certain aspects. So, for example, it might be necessary that if a company wants to go green, that costs so much money that they might have to fire some people which do not work that efficiently. So there's a trade-off needed between various factors. So yes, that is a concern I have with how exactly would those kind of decisions, which there is a pro and a con, how exactly would those situations work under this proposal. But well, I also think that it is a step in the right direction, and that these kind of concerns shouldn't stop us from trying to implement such a proposal as this, because the legal system will, I think, also have a way of like
Yeah.
changing or taking into consideration these difficulties and addressing them in a suitable way, for example, through jurisprudence or other cases which have had similar issues. So I think in the end we both agree this is something we should do, even though it will encounter practical difficulties.
Yeah.
And I think I also think it should be done on an EU level, like you said, because well, I don't know if you said it, but you mentioned something about the European Union. Is that in order to really make a change in this world, it needs to be on a broad scale and a bigger scale. And European Union is the exact platform for the Netherlands to do such a thing. So
Definitely.
that's
So I definitely. So on the first question, we would say that whether we agree with Jaap Winter or not, like the stance that we take, the tone, that's not something we both agree on, but the proposal that he has made, the step that he's made forward, that's something we definitely agree with. Then I would actually still ask the question: do you think there's room for company law? Because that was the second question that was
yeah.
Simon, and you already mentioned jurisprudence. For example, we're talking about the duty of care. We both already discussed, I think, a few weeks ago with another friend about the duty of care with the cases of Shell and the case of KLM that you both mentioned. Yes, right. So when thinking of that, we would say that with the Vendetta case and also with the newest case, there is already soft law regulating the duty of care. That, for example, the mother company of Shell, they have a duty of care towards their conducts in foreign countries. That's something that's already exists. So do you still think that on a company like law level, whether it's national or EU level, we should still regulate it? Because that's for me a very difficult point, as we already have soft law. Do we want to have hard law on this as well?
Well, that's an interesting point. I do think it is actually possible to make this into hard law, because I think in that case it will have much more of an impact, that companies will really feel more bound by it. But for example, I would propose maybe a system such as it has been used in Delaware, which is the business judgment rule which they apply there, which is in principle we don't interfere with management decisions unless, and then well, there are some conditions. So maybe it would a good way to implement it would be to do it like that, like make it hard law, make companies really accountable, but still also afford them some leverage. And I think in a lot of cases, the fact that a company is brought to court is already a very big deterrent for a company, because they don't want the bad media attention. So I think even the threat of being able to go to court may already have a positive impact in itself. But what do you think?
Definitely, I actually really agree with this point. It was a quite a refreshing point. So, indeed, if we implement such a law, if there is something as the Delaware court with the business judgment rule that we do not interfere with the like internal management too much, then that would give ground. That would provide still freedom for companies to make their own decisions, etc. But it still also give ground for third parties to step into this if something really goes wrong. So I definitely agree with that. But I think like we are really talking about like media attention, etc. So we're both thinking on the level of big corporations that that have a really big impact, on our society. So I would actually make a restriction on this regulation stating that as of how many profit or how many revenue, I think revenue is better, revenue you make, then this law applies in order to protect the smaller companies as well. Because yeah.
I totally agree with you there. Also, because he doesn't specify it in his article, I think, but I really do have the idea that he is talking about the big corporations, or at least the bigger corporations in the Netherlands. So, and I think a lot of the criticism also is specifically applies to these corporations. So I agree with you totally that the bakery on the corner should have a little more leeway than I don't know, Shell. Those are not comparable. So yeah, I think that's actually a very good point. I would agree with you there.
Definitely, because I actually mentioned this point because I was actually not sure whether Mr. Winter was excluding those other companies, because he was mentioning the BVM, and like a BV can be small, it can be big, and if you introduce the BVM, I'm not sure whether it's on page 98. The BVM would be like an enterprise that is really taking into account the social factors or something, and it's a limited company with societal orientation. And with that, I was really hesitant about introducing such a company, for the same reason that if you're an NV or a normal BV, are you then a company that does not take into account the societal orientation? Why would you need a BVM if you want every NV, every BV to be a corporate social responsible citizen? And the BVM would be of no use, in my opinion, if that's the big,
But isn't he advocating that the approach of the BVM should be the approach of all companies?
If that is the case, why would you then introduce the BVM? Then, for me, it would make no sense. If you want all the companies to go into the direction of a BVM, why would you then introduce BVM? Because
then if that's the case, then on that point, I would say start with the bigger companies. Also, because, for example, that's also the approach they take with the gender quota, right, in the Netherlands. That's those restrictions also only apply to companies which have a certain size. So I think it's an issue which is very similar to that. So I think that's the approach that should be followed. So, but I think we talked a long time.
As well. I think so. We have answered all the questions. I do want to have a brief summary.
Well, maybe for the last two, the question about company law and
the European level.
So do we think it should be handled in company law? We do. We also think that hard law would be actually a preferable option, as long as the court would allow some room for management thinking. So give them some leeway, that's the word I was looking for. It should only apply to bigger companies, and with respect to the EU or national company law level, we think this is something that should be implemented on EU level, because it will have a much bigger impact compared to when we implement it on only a national level. Right? Have I summarized it correctly?
Definitely, fully. Maybe just one more explanation on the last point, because I don't think we have really elaborated on this point, but why EU level and not national level? I think from an economic point of view, I think we both study economics. If the Netherlands were to be the only country that sets such a regulation that every holding that is in our that is established in the Netherlands should take into account the other environmental or societal factors, that would be a restraint for other companies to establish their company over here,
Yeah,
comparison to other
especially
tech.
especially taking into consideration the freedom of establishment, which is well, with case law as well as with new regulations only increasing more and more. So yeah, to avoid a company flight, so to say, that's also, yes, I agree with you there, that's also a very important point for or an advantage for doing this in an EU level.
Definitely. Great. I
Okay.
think that we have summarized this all, and it was a great reflection. It was actually very interesting.
Yes, it was interesting. Okay, well, thank you for listening. I hope you made it this far.
Thank you.
Bye
Okay.
bye.
See you Monday. Ciao.